Okay, we're going to start.
Great, we'll let people filter in here. And I think we'll get started. Hello, everyone. My name is April Armstrong. I am Professor of Dermatology and Associate Dean for Clinical Research at the Keck School of Medicine here. I am so excited today to be joined by my dear colleagues whom you see on the screen here. And we're so excited to have the session today really focusing on advice from the Battleground inside the NIH study section. So as you will see, our panelists are all have scars from the battles. That's why they're here, and but they're here to tell their stories. And I'm going to introduce them to you. First, I want to just thank Nikki and Christina here, Dr. Karen Port and Christina, for also helping to run some of our slide program today. So to start out with, we have Dr. Shanita Hughes-Halbert, who is Vice Chair for Research in the Department of Population and Public Health Sciences, as well as Associate Director for Cancer Equity. Following that, we have Dr. Art Toga, who is our Provost Professor of Ophthalmology, Neurology, Psychiatry, and the Behavioral Sciences, Radiology, and Engineering, and I think there are a few other specialties missing there, but who is also Chair of Neuroscience and Director of Stevens Neuroimaging and Informatics Institute. So welcome, Art. And then we have Dr. Gage Crump, who is Professor of Stem Cell Biology and Regenerative Medicine and Integrative Anatomical Sciences. Welcome, Gage. And then we have Dr. Sarah Ham-Alvarez, who is Professor of Ophthalmology and Pharmacology and Pharmaceutical Sciences and Associate Dean for Basic and Translational Research. Great. And lastly, but not least, we have Dr. Thomas Buchanan, who is Professor of Medicine and Vice Dean for Research at KSOM and Director of CTSI and the Division Chief for Endocrinology. So today I'm going to welcome Tom. I'm going to share my screen with regards to the agenda. And okay, so we will first have Dr. Hughes-Halbert talking to us in about 10 minutes about the inside scoop on NIH study sections to give really an overview with regards to the structure of study sections and what that composed of. And then we have Dr. Toga talking to us about how to think like a reviewer. And then we'll have Dr. Crump talking to us about strategies for grant renewal, which is a topic that's often of interest for those who are funded, but are interested to get that continuing funding. And then we'll have that for 40 minutes. And after each person's sort of mini talk, there will be a quick Q&A session right after their talk. And then for part two, we will enter into a panel discussion with everyone here and discussing, talking about some of the key mistakes that people can make on their research applications to NIH. And we're really focusing on, because there are different types of grant opportunities, we're really focusing on research applications. And then we'll talk about the different components of that and what mistakes can be made in those sections and how we can avoid them. And also with that, so for our audience, this is an opportunity for you to engage with our panelists. So please submit your questions using the Q&A feature anytime throughout the meeting. And we will be monitoring for that. So please do that. Please don't use the chat feature. We will not be looking at the chat for your questions. So remember to use the Q&A feature in your Zoom function. And lastly, the meeting will be recorded and later posted online. So just as a FYI for everyone. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and Nikki's going to share her screen. And while she brings the slides onto her screen, I wanted to bring Dr. Shanita Hughes-Halbert here, who will talk to us about the inside the scoop on the study sections. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this important webinar. What I wanted to do today is just talk a little bit about the overview of NIH study sections. And I have to say, as I was putting these slides together, it made me remember the first R01 or first grant application that I submitted, and feeling kind of a little bit lost because, you know, there's certainly the whole process of writing your grant application. But then you really don't have, you know, I didn't feel that I had the, you know, in-depth knowledge or any knowledge about what happened with my application once it went to a study section. So I think this is a great topic for us to address today. Just a little bit about my background as it relates to study sections. So I've been a standing member of study sections. I've been a chair of study section, and I have also more recently been just a ad hoc member of study sections. So I think I can speak to, as everyone on the panel, speak to the sort of the inside scoop of NIH study sections from a variety of perspectives. Next slide, please. So I thought it would be helpful to just orient you to the grant process and an overview perspective. So one is, you know, where does your application go when you're submitting it to NIH or the National Institutes of Health? Most applications are processed and reviewed, and your review is handled by the Center for Scientific Review. And their website is shown at the bottom of the screen. And so the Center for Scientific Review is responsible for receiving and reviewing applications that are submitted to NIH. And I believe they sort of process about 75% of the applications that are submitted to NIH. The other components of the review process are reviewers, and it's a peer review process, which means that it's a panel of experts who are responsible for assessing the scientific merit and impact of applications using established criteria. You know, one of the things I hope that we'll get an opportunity to talk about today is the process, or the scoring metrics has changed over time. And, you know, because it used to be a 1 to 5 scale, now it's a 1 to 9 scale or 1 to 10 scale. But the lower the score, the better the priority score is in terms of the scientific merit of your application. So study sections. So there are two things to think about with respect to study sections. One is that the integrated review group is a collection of sections that are clustered together around a scientific area. And then within that IRG, there are individual study sections that are composed of scientists who are experts in the field, who are asked to serve on a study section or participate in a review based on their stature, their own track record and expertise in an area, to be able to provide mature and objective feedback. There's also consideration given to diversity in study sections, both in terms of gender, racial and ethnic background, and geographic location. I think one of the most important decisions that you can make as it relates to your grant application, in addition to the scientific focus, is making a good decision about the study section where your application will be reviewed. That is something that an applicant can request, although it may not be honored, or CSR, the Center for Scientific Review, may make a different decision. But having an understanding of the specific study section that is likely to have the expertise in your particular area to evaluate the scientific merit and impact of your application is critically important. What I would offer as advice at this point is, check out the the website for the Center for Scientific Review. And within that, you can search for study sections by discipline. They have a list and it shows you the roster of individuals who serve on the study section. And I would say, you want to make sure that you're requesting that your application be assigned to the study section that has individuals that their work, you've cited their work, so that you are able to really match your science, your proposed research with the expertise that's represented on the study section. The graphic shown on the sort of in this to get started also comes from the Center for Scientific Review. And I thought it was helpful just to give an overview of sort of what happens from the perspective of submitting an application. So, certainly understanding and being prepared as you apply for the writing your application. But really, the focus for our discussion today is the receipt and referral and then the peer review process. So next slide, please. So I think it's really important to understand that one of the main goals of the peer review process, and just to understand, is that NIH is responsible for ensuring that there is in their oversight of the review process that is fair and objective. And then we as scientists are responsible for evaluating the scientific merit. So, this is something I think is really important to keep in mind. There's been a lot of discussion about the peer review process and whether or not, it's if and how it works, if there should be a different system put in place. But I'll share an opinion that, it really is a process that is designed to to ensure that everyone gets a fair review. That we can talk about later on in our discussion where and how there have been critiques of the system and the process, particularly as it relates to the lack of racial and ethnic diversity and differences in terms of funding that have been made based on the types of application. But I would say overall that, the system is set up and the process of peer review is set up so that it's meant to be fair and objective. So there is the NIH controls the process and provides oversight of the process and make sure that there's free of conflict of interest, that policy issues and compliance is adhered to during the review process, and then that the study sections are run in compliance with established protocols, and that the scientists are the ones who actually make the decisions and evaluate the scientific merit. So next slide. So what happens? So this cartoon also comes from the Center for Scientific Review, and there are a couple of key players in the study section. So you've written your grant application. It is submitted by by the school or the research center. So the University of Southern California, an academic institution, or some other recognized organization is responsible for actually submitting the application. That goes to the center. From there, it goes to the Center for Scientific Review that's assigned to an integrated review group or study section. From there, the study section reviews it for scientific merit. And then the Institute is responsible for evaluating applications based on its relevance for that particular funding portfolio. Then the applications that are recommended for funding are presented to an advisory council and boards that then makes a recommendation for funding. And then it's really left to the institute director or their designated appointees to take final action with respect to making a funding decision. Applications that are funded, the funds are dispersed. And then it comes back to the investigator who then conducts the research. So a couple of key players in the process. One is the scientific review officer. That's the designated federal official who's responsible for ensuring that that the study section and the review process is completed according to policies and procedures. And as part of that, they will provide instructions to study section members about policy issues, particularly related to conflict of interest and confidentiality. They'll also review important policies and procedures, and then make sure that everyone understands administrative issues related to meeting logistics. And so from there, the chair of the study section is responsible for orienting the reviewers about the review process. The scientific review officer, as I've said before, is primarily responsible for making sure that the policies and procedures are being followed and that the applications receive a fair and objective review. And so part of that, just as an example, I just served on a study section last week, and it was actually the first time in my experience serving on study sections that the agenda had been allocated into, time blocks. So each application had about 20 minutes for discussion. And then the reviewers were given like 2 minutes, 1 minute, half a second or half a minute to sort of offer comments. And that timetable was really followed to make sure that all the applications received a fairly equitable amount of discussion, because you can imagine that, if you sort of, and I can see why they would have implemented that process, because and it made me remember back to my early days on serving on study sections, where the applications that got discussed in the beginning of the day tended to get perhaps more of a robust discussion than those that were scheduled and slotted just by the luck of the draw to be discussed at the end of the day. So the SRO is responsible for keeping the meeting moving and also for taking really good notes. That's critically important to us as applicants, because the notes that are taken during the study section and part of the review ultimately are included in the resume and summary of the discussion. And that's critically important for understanding the strengths and weaknesses and where the reviewers felt that there were primary opportunities for improvement. And that becomes important as applications may need to be revised. So the SRO also makes sure that that the critiques, the information that's provided in the critique is consistent with the score, and that it reflects changes, and that they're revised to reflect changes that may need to be made based on the discussion. And then they also are responsible for asking reviewers who may or may not have been as one of the assigned reviewers but have made an important point to provide comments in a brief paragraph. Again, the ultimate goal is to provide feedback to the applicant so that that they understand, the tenor of the discussion, the primary weaknesses and strengths as they're making preparations for submitting a revised application or responding to a request for a response to the critique as part of helping an institute, an advisory council, or program staff present the application to the advisory council. So the other person that's critical in the study section is the program official. So the program official is really there as an observer, but they're an important part because they provide relevant administrative, policy, or historical information about a particular funding opportunity when requested by the SRO. They also are there to observe the process and to take notes And this is really critically important because your program official is the individual that you would correspond with and talk to after the study section has been completed, to sort of understand in more detail and to understand sort of the primary concerns that were identified and discussed. And so the last sort of role for the program official is to sort of participate and be an observer in the study section to help guide future program priorities and recommendations for funding. So I've already talked about the study section chair, who's responsible for sort of making sure that the meeting flows is moving forward and that all applications are getting a fair and objective discussion, and sort of raising points where there's inconsistency between the tenor of the discussion and the scores that are being assigned. And then, you know, the key players in all of this are reviewers. So next slide. And reviewers are people who are scientists who have expertise in the field. And so the study section is composed of both standing members and individuals who may be asked and invited to participate in that particular review meeting to provide expertise about a domain that's not currently represented among the member. So what happens? So this is a picture from online somewhere, but now study sections are being held virtually. So I think we have to update our images now, because we don't sort of sit around a table anymore. But hopefully we'll be able to come back to this venue. So the study section starts with the SRO, the scientific review officer official, introducing and providing an orientation. Study section members introduce themselves. There's an opportunity for applications to have a discussion about applications that are not likely to be recommended for funding based on their preliminary scores. An important point to understand about this is that although the score, the distribution of scores may decide which applications get discussed in the meeting, reviewers do have the opportunity and are encouraged that if there's any application that they want to discuss, if it has a lower score, then it can be included in the discussion. So the score isn't the only driving factor that determines if an application is discussed or not. So there's typically 3 reviewers who are assigned, a primary, secondary, and tertiary reviewers who provide their scores and critiques. This most recent one that I was on actually had discussants, which I think was the first time that I've ever seen that role in a study section. But again, the discussant was there to provide clarifications as needed for a particular application. So the primary reviewer is responsible for providing information about the purpose of the study, overview of the research design, and then to summarize sort of the key review criteria in terms of its significance, approach, investigators, facilities, and resources. And then the secondary reviewer also goes through the review criteria, offering where there's a difference or has additional information to be added. So from there, the discussion is open up to the entire study section. And this is an opportunity for all the reviewers to ask questions about a comment that was made by reviewers, something that they read in the application that they have questions about. It's really intended to be the place where there are clarifying questions made so that people can understand why and how an application is being scored in a particular way. From there, the discussion is summarized, and this is summarized by the chair, highlighting sort of summarizing the overarching strengths, weaknesses, impact, and significance of the application. And then the reviewers provide their scores, again, based on the discussion. And I would say the main goal for the whole process is for there to be convergence. And this was something that a term that the chair of this last study section I was just on most recently said, that it was, we at the end of the discussion, we may have started with one of us having like a 1.2, to a 2.5, and then, scores in between there. But after the discussion, there was more of a convergence between the scores. Having said that, the goal isn't for the scores to all be clustered in the same, sort of around the same range or number. It's really meant to be using the entire range of scores is encouraged. But if you can think of, for those of you who have submitted application, you see one reviewer has scored it really high and one reviewer has scored, has a lot of concerns, you're kind of not sure where and how what the overall gestalt is for the review of the application. So reviewers are then asked to provide their scores again based on the discussion. Study section members, if they're going to be voting outside of the range, are asked to indicate that and to provide a written justification why they're voting outside of the range. And from there, and this takes place after the study section is completed, the overall priority score based on based from that study section is then provided to the applicant in the form of a summary statement. And your priority score tends to be made available to you before the summary statement. And then once it goes through the peer review process through a study section, then it's the applicant then is going to interact with the program official to discuss, the contents and their review. Next slide. And that was my last slide. So we'll now take some questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Hughes-Halbert. There have been very active and engaging questions in the Q&A section. So I want to encourage people to read the wonderfully open as well as answers. So we'll go to the open question. One is who decides if a grant is triaged? Is the reviewer. And number two is about the ESI status, got triaged a few times in a row. So maybe sure. These questions, yep.
Yeah, so it's actually the study section in its entirety who decides if a grant is triaged, and it's really made based on the scores. So, and typically, it's the applications that fall within the lower half of whatever the distribution of scores are for that particular study section. So, the point I wanted to make earlier was that there's a sort of all the applications are presented with their, according to where they are, what their score is. And, there's a discussion about whether or not the applications who fall within the lower half or the bottom half should be discussed, should not be discussed at that meeting. And it's really for the entire study section to reach consensus on. So if one person says, well, hey, I'd like to discuss this application, even though it doesn't fall, the score may not indicate that it has a scientific merit based on the score that it has gotten from the reviewers to fall within the range of being funded. But if a reviewer, anyone on the study section feels that it should be discussed, then they, so long as they indicate that, then it's not it's discussed as part of the as part of the study section.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hughes Halbert, again, for a really very important introduction to our session. And then the other open comment from Dr. Kerman, I'll have Dr. Hughes Halbert to kind of address that with a Q&A function. Now we're going to go to Dr. Toga, who will tell us about how to think like a reviewer coming from someone who has served on many study sections. Go ahead, Dr. Toga.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. There aren't any secrets here. I would just like to start out by saying that I'll spend about 10 minutes telling you my own perspectives and a few of the things that I think about. But I mean, I just hope the audience views this as just one person's point of view. Certainly, I've been around a long time and I've done a lot of grants and sat on a lot of study sections and even served on council for 5 years. So I know a little bit about how the process works, but I think all of you have to take on the way in which you would like to deal with things. How do you think a reviewer will react? And I'll just tell you what I think. So if we go to the next slide, I'll just start out by talking about a few things that are important. Because not only do you have to think like a reviewer, but you have to put your grant in a place where you think it's going to do well. And acronymology is important. And these are acronyms that I'm sure you've seen in announcements from NIH, and they mean different things, and there are important distinctions between them. First, an RFP is a program that results in a contract, not a grant. And that is a different thing. That has different requirements, both in reporting and otherwise. And I think those of you that may be new to the game should think carefully about responding to an RFP. An RFA is a request for applications, and it's really a more narrowly defined area that one or more agencies have put money aside for awarding grants. Now, that's a good thing. That means they want to spend in this area. So you're not going into a normal study section arrangement. It might, in fact, include what's called a special emphasis panel, or an SEP. And that means the experts, as you've just heard described very well, that are recruited to review these proposals often have a distinct interest in this area. Not only are they experts, but they work in this area maybe exclusively. So that can be a good thing because they're going to be interested in the topic in which you're applying for. The next one's a program announcement. That's sort of a more general thing. And the final one is an RFI. And I put that on there because I think that's also important. That stands for Request for Information. And what these are is NIH is thinking about making an offering, either an RFA or a program announcement in a particular area, and they want some input on that. What are the things that are important in that area? What are the opportunities scientifically that NIH should consider spending money on? And I almost always respond to these. And the reason I do, the ones that are relevant to me anyway, the reason I do is it allows me to have some tiny bit of influence as to how the program announcement or RFA is written. And obviously I want them to write requests that are something that I can respond to. So if an RFA shows up and it's in an area that you happen to be interested in, it's certainly worthwhile for you to spend, an hour or two writing a page that goes into some committee in NIH where they're making decisions about new offerings for funding. So I encourage you to take a look at those things. That's a little bit outside what I was supposed to talk about here, but I think that's important as you think about strategies in terms of what grants you're going to apply for, where they go, and so forth. And so in the next slide, I could talk a little bit about some of the very same issues that you just heard about, but in a slightly different way. So yes, I've been on study sections. I understand how it works, and many of you probably do too. But when you're thinking about submitting a grant, it's not a bad idea to reach out to the program officer before you submit. And you say to that person, hey, look, I saw this RFA or I saw this program announcement, and I'm thinking of submitting the following topic. And here's a 1-paragraph description of what it is I wanted to submit. What do you think? And usually they'll say something like, that is responsive to our announcement, depending on how well you know the program officer. And sometimes they're a little more giving, and they can say, oh, that's a great idea. I really encourage you to submit. Or that's a great idea, but it's not quite what we were looking for. Maybe look at this RFA or look at this program announcement. And so right away, you're beginning to tailor what it is you're interested in with what the NIH is interested in. And that marriage is really important, because the program officer, although they don't have a significant role as part of the review, they do if you happen to end up with a score that's right on the cusp. They can begin to argue in your behalf when it goes to council, for example, or sometimes they have funding committee meetings, depending upon where they are in their fiscal year and they need to spend money or they're running out of money. So I do think it's worthwhile reaching out to a program officer, especially those that are named in specific program announcements or RFAs. And you just heard a lot about the SRA and the CSR roles here, so I'm not going to really say anything about that. But I'm going to say something about the last of the first 4 bullet items here. Know the panel. So you heard a little bit about the panel is comprised of experts who are recruited to pass an evaluation and provide a critique to you regarding your proposal. Well, there are standing panels in which the panelists serve a certain term, typically 3 or sometimes more years, and they will stay there. So you can see who they are year by year, and you can look them up. You can see what papers have they published on, what is their area of expertise, how senior or junior they are, and that makes a big difference, and sort of get to know who it is that you're talking to. And I think that is really important, because if you have written a proposal and your references or your discussion of the literature does not include some of the people who are going to actually be writing your critique, and it is relevant, well, you can think of the psychology there. They're not going to be as enthusiastic. Why didn't you cite my paper? I wrote about that last year. You should know that literature. So I think you need to think about that. Get in the mindset of who the reviewer is. It's not necessarily insulting that you didn't include that person's paper, but it's a little bit of a psychology that I think you should consider. And the final statement on this slide, the wisdom of Willie Sutton. I'm not sure how many of you know who Willie Sutton was. He was a bank robber. And I don't necessarily mean to equate grant getting with robbing banks, but he was famously asked, why is it that you rob banks? And his answer was, well, that's where the money is. And so I put that down there, as a little bit of a tongue in cheek, because you want to go to a place where there's money. And that means that when there's an RFA or program announcement, sometimes they specify how much money they've set aside. When you go to a certain institute within NIH, don't go to one necessarily that has the lowest pay line. Go to one that has a more generous pay line if the same topics will fit. And that, again, can be discussed with the program officer. So it's a good idea to kind of be cognizant about the whole system. You heard a great talk just before mine, which described the mechanics of the system. But NIH is a big institution made up of people. Understand the goings and comings of that place is important as you tailor your proposal to fit a certain institute and a certain panel. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so now the proposal, and I'm talking about this from the mind of a reviewer. Okay, so the reviewer has to deal with, and I can't remember whether she just said that or not, but a reviewer is going to deal with a bunch of grants. They get assigned maybe 6 or 8 or 10 different proposals, which they have to do in a day. And so it's a lot of work. You've got these 12-page proposals. You've got to figure out what the person's talking about. And it is hard work to write a constructive and comprehensive review, which covers all the components of a proposal and the science therein and the likelihood of success and the contributions that it makes to the literature and so forth. So it's a lot of work, and you want to give the reviewer a hand at doing that. You don't want to make it more difficult for them. They have a lot of work to do in that day and often weeks before that day. And so you want to try to create a proposal that makes it easy for them to review it. So first, make sure it has structure to it. yes, there are sections that you have to have, such as innovation and significance and approach and so forth, but you can structure within those sections to help the reviewer. Enumerate the things that you want to tell them. For example, in innovation, you might say, this proposal is innovative for the 4 following reasons. 1, 2, 3, 4. It gives the reviewer the chance to go back and look at that as they're writing their review and say, oh, well, those things really are innovative. They're concise, they're bolded, they're enumerated. I get it. Make sure that the language is clear. There's a great little book called Strunk and White, which has to deal with how to write succinctly and clearly and not use too many words that you don't need. Be clear, be comprehensive. Make sure that you cover the topic in a way that also demonstrates your expertise and your sort of understanding of the breadth of it and what role this proposal has in the scientific area in terms of what it's going to contribute. Brevity. Don't add stuff you don't need to, because everybody has to deal with all these things. White space in a proposal is great. You don't have to cram your 12 pages in whatever, whether it's 10 or 11 point that you have to have now, with every single bit covered with a letter. You don't have to do that. Make sure that it reads comfortably so that the reviewer can flip through this thing and really appreciate what you're trying to say, why you're trying to say it, when is it going to happen, and how are you going to do it, and who you are. That's the bullet right here. What you're talking about comes from the aims. That's a 1-page introduction as to what this proposal is about. Be really clear. What are the aims? What are the hypotheses? Why are you doing this? What does it matter? Is it contributing something that's really important? How are you going to do it? When are you going to do it? And who you are all critically important sections in this document that you're creating here. I put another bullet here, which I just titled Other Stuff. And what I mean by that is, as you're writing your approach section, obviously the experiments can go wrong. They might not work. What do? Tell the reviewer you've given that some thought. Your experimental design will do these following things using this methodology with these types of analyses validated in the following way. And if it goes wrong, here is what I'm going to do. And this is why I'm going to do that. It allows me to save the experiments. It allows me to better understand what's going on scientifically, and I can describe that and make a contribution. And as I just sort of mentioned, validation is important no matter what it is you're doing. Are the methods validated? Is the overall design validated? Is it statistically validated? You must validate every single section. You can't just say, I'm going to do this. You have to show, I'm going to do this. I'm going to check I'm doing the right thing in the following way. And then the final bullet on this slide says, block the critique. Now, what I mean by that is write the proposal, sit down, read it back to yourself and say, if I was a reviewer, where could I find a problem? Where are the holes in this proposal that provide a liability to me? And I need to close that. I need to block that critique so that the reviewer doesn't get a chance to say, oh, but they didn't consider this. Oh, but they didn't do that. You need to think like a reviewer so that you can block those kinds of things and avoid getting that as a criticism, which will damage your score. Next slide. Okay, now let's say you've written this thing. You put all those pieces in there and you think, you know, this is a good grant. I've got my science in there. It's well organized. My language is good. I've had other people read it. I think it's strong. I think it's clear. Let's put it together. And what I mean by produce to please is you want to produce a document that looks professional. As I said, not jam-packed with a lot of letters and words that are just painful for the reviewer to go through, but produce this like a document that somebody opens it up and says, oh, well, that's unique. That's really well put together. It's organized. The fontology is nice. The figures are well done. The space in there, I understand what's being said. I understand the graphics. It's well done. If you can produce a document like this that's well done, I think you can produce the science well done. That's my own view. I like to put bullets and make it bold and beautiful. And I mean this very sincerely. The document should look like these people are professionals. They know how to conduct science. They know how to describe it. They know how to produce a document. They clearly will be able to produce good publications. I want to have that feeling if I'm a reviewer and I want to pay for this grant. I want to think that's the case. And so I encourage you to think like that so that you get something at the end of the day that is comfortable for the reviewer to look at and impresses upon that reviewer that you really know what you're doing. You're a consummate professional at every level. Next slide. So now, how would you react to this if you're a reviewer? Remember, I want you to think like a reviewer yourself as you're producing these things. Well, you already heard what triage means. I'm a little older than some of the folks on the panel. In the old days, it used to be called NERF, which was an acronym that meant not recommended for further review. It's the same thing as triage. So if that happens, and I hope it doesn't, but if that happens to you, you've got to think twice about taking that grant and resubmitting it. And the reason is the next time you resubmit it and it goes to the very same panel again, the panelists know that it's a resubmission of a NERFed grant or a triaged grant. Right away, you're at a disadvantage, I think. Now, people will argue about this, but my own view is if that happens to somebody that works for me, or if it happens to me, I will generally toss it. I'll start over. I'll take that grant and I'm going to rewrite it with a new title. I'm just going to start over because I don't want the baggage, the negative baggage of having a triaged grant and try to get to a point where it's a fundable score. That's a very difficult thing to do. If you do resubmit your grant, and you're going to hear a little bit more of that from Cage, I think, be careful about arguing with the reviewer. Don't do it. Don't do rebuttals that are challenging. Just say, great idea. We understand it. This is what we're going to do to fix it. You just be nice. It's harder for a reviewer to be nasty to you when you've acquiesced to their requests. And deja vu all over again. What I mean there is, aside from it being funny, what I mean there is two things. One is if you're submitting a grant for renewal, don't make the same mistakes again. And two, make sure what your grant is saying is in fact new. People do not want to see old things. It's just not a good way for the government to spend money. So make sure that it's very clear about what new contributions you're making on a new proposal. If it's a resubmission of a failed grant, make sure you've said what's new about this. You're just not sending the same grant again, hoping for a better score. It won't happen. Next slide. Okay. I think, is this my last one? It might be. Yeah, it's my last one. So tell your mom about your science. It's not a bad idea, those of you whose moms are still around. If you can, and what I really mean is tell the science to somebody else or let them read it. And if the response is, yeah, that's nice, you're dead. There's too many grants being submitted. The pay lines are, 15% and less. So it has to be really good. It has to be exciting. It has to be something that somebody says, that's a good idea. That should be done. That's the response you need. That is a good idea. That's really going to contribute to the field. I'd be curious to see what outcomes you get there. If you get that response, you're on the right track. If somebody says, oh, that's well written, it's nice, then go back to the drawing board. The second bullet says, pass the elevator test. I'm sure you've all heard of this. And the test is, if you get in an elevator with somebody and say, oh, what's that about? You got to answer it in about 3 or 4 sentences. If you can't do that, then it's not going to do well. And that means that has to be on the aims page and often on the very first page of the grant. What is this about? Say it clearly, say it succinctly, and make sure you convey the message. This is a great idea and it needs to be done. And the final thing I'll just close with, which is my funny way of dealing with review panels. Review panels are made up of people and they all have their own point of view. And I like to track it. So we track who reviews our grants. And we wrote a piece of software, which we called iCRAP. This was many years ago. And it stands for Committee Review and Performance. And the idea was every grant that our institute submitted, we would track what panel it went to, who the members on that panel were, and we would see how well it did. And we would try to guess who were being the primary, secondary, and tertiary reviewers. Now, back in those days, you could do that. Nowadays, they have long, long lists of reviewers, only some of which are actually participating in the review, basically, I think, to avoid people from doing something like this. But I think the message here is know your reviewer, think like your reviewer, and I think you'll do a little better. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Art. That was very, very good as usual, and consummate professional at every level, I shall say.
Except my slides are pretty crappy, though, right?
Well, you have the iCrap program, so there's a. I'm sure a lot of our attendees will be interested in using that program. We did have, looks like, one question of clarification. I think I know the answer, but I'll have you clarify for our audience member here. I think it's talking about a not discussed grant. If you could just clarify for us, do you mean to resubmit it as a resubmission or submit it as a new submission?
I'm suggesting that you submit it as a new submission. Once you've gotten not discussed, it's hard to overcome that.
Great. All right. Thank you very much, Art. And we're going to go to Dr. Gage Crump. I know when we're having fun, time flies. And then Dr. Crump is going to talk to us about some strategies for grant renewal. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so it's a really hard act to follow from Art. And I think he makes great points about having grants just be really clear and easy to read, because I've seen so many good, in theory, good grants just get trashed at study section because they're so dense and so hard to get through. And that's a really common criticism. So I'm actually not going to talk about resubmitting a grant but I'm talking about, and this should be fairly brief. This is to renew a grant that you've already had, for example, an R01 for another, 4 or 5 years. And actually, I don't really look at renewals of R01s that differently than new submission. I think there's only a few things that make them different. And on this slide, I've really put the two things which I think are the major considerations. So one is productivity. So if you're renewing your R01 or some other, I guess should make it more generalizable, but any sort of grant that can be renewed. One of the first things the reviewers are going to look at is, well, how productive were they on the last cycle? And so I think it can vary depending on the field you're in, but for my field at least, which is developmental and stem cell biology, usually you want to see about one major, or one last author, corresponding author publication for about every year of the grant. And I should point out that for NIH review now, bioRxiv and other preprints count toward the total. For a recent renewal, which I had submitted and looks like I will be awarded, only had about 3 publications, but in addition to that, we had 2 bioRxiv papers, one of which has now been accepted, and including those 2 extra bioRxiv, I think really helped in terms of productivity. So certainly NIH encourages and counts bioRxiv and other preprint papers. It also helps that at least 1 or 2 of the papers in the previous cycle are in pretty high impact journals. So to show that you've done something of significance in the last period in which you were funded. So if your productivity isn't very good, I would suggest going for a new R01 rather than trying to renew your grant. If you only have 1 or 2 or maybe 3 papers and they're in not terribly high impact journals, you might be better off not trying to renew your grant, but just submitting the same proposal but as a new R01. The other important criteria, which I think Art touched on, is it really needs to go in a significant new direction. What reviewers don't want to see is that while your previous grant, which was scored well and funded, was some exciting new direction, and now you've already published the landmark paper and a follow-up paper or 2. And so you don't want to give an appearance that now you're kind of getting into the weeds and the details of your system or your model, and then this is going to be more of an incremental advance. So that's often renewals are criticized for being incremental, and that the last cycle was really exciting, but now you're just kind of figuring out the details and dotting the I's. So really you want at least one of the aims to be significantly different than your previous R01, or preferably 2 out of 3 if it's a 3-aim grant. And really something that's going to keep the reviewers excited and saying, well, here this person has come up with a new system or has shown expertise, and now there's this exciting new results that really take it in a fundamentally different direction. And so I think that's also very, very important for renewal, so that you're not seen as being incremental. And it could also help to bring in new experience for renewal. So think of new co-investigators or collaborators that you can bring in to really demonstrate that the renewal is going to go in new directions that the previous cycle didn't. So obviously it needs some tenuous connection, or maybe more than tenuous connection with the prior R01. But it's actually okay to change the title of your renewal R01. That's something I didn't realize until recently, because the grant number is what stays the same, not the name of the title of the grant. Okay, next slide. Okay, so there's really not that much different about an R01 renewal versus a new R01 in terms of the aspects, but there's just a couple points that that are unique to a renewal. So first is you're going to need a progress report. So typically this is about a page in my experience, summarizing progress on each aim of the prior R01. And this is included as part of the research strategy. So for an R01, this is a 12-page limit, which means now that you have, in addition to your progress report, if that's 1 page, you have 11 pages left for the rest of the research strategy. And I think it's flexible. I don't think there's any hard guidelines of where to insert this, but I typically place it kind of between background and preliminary studies. So background would just be, kind of what the general description of your field and what other groups have published and what's known. And then your progress report would be really what you've done to advance it in the previous period. And then you'd have preliminary studies, typically unpublished studies, that really kind of set up the renewal part that will go beyond what was simply accomplished in the previous aims. And then there's also a progress report publication section. And so this is where you list any paper that was reported in the previous cycle. And in theory on, my NCBI that's linked to NIH, when you publish a paper on your grant, you should be linking the papers that you published to your specific NIH grant. So when you have your progress report publications, in theory, they should be linked online to the previous cycle. Though I should say that there's not people double checking this during your review. And so it's not like a progress report that those have done progress reports where it kind of include those publications that need to be linked. Here it's essentially a piece of paper listing your publications. So there's a little bit flexible in that regard. I've seen people also abuse kind of the progress report publications by reporting a lot of publications that had nothing to do with the previous cycle. I don't know if every reviewer does it, but when I'm a reviewer, I'll actually kind of go through what they report as their progress report publications. And then I'll pull out ones which I think really pertain to their grant. And I had this kind of inherent bias against investigators who kind of overclaim publications that were performed in their lab, but really had nothing to do with the grant that they're renewing. So that's just something to be aware of. Don't try to overclaim publications. In addition, your reviewers, if it's a renewal, they'll actually get your summary statement of the original R01 that was awarded that you're trying to renew. So that would be from 4 or 5 years ago, and they'll see what the previous criticisms were on your previous R01. And so the reviewers will get a sense really of what your previous aims were, but the reviewers will not get your previous grant. They won't see what your specific aims or research strategy sections were. And so I think you shouldn't be too concerned about whether or not you've actually done or completed all of the aims on your previous grant. I think it's more important that you've published well in something related to the aims of that previous grant. Because I think everyone knows that science is very dynamic and is changing from year to year. And what you propose in a grant 3 or 4 years later, may not be your current thinking or what's most important in the field. So I really think it's the publications that you've shown that you've been able to publish well in this field. And don't worry so much, well, maybe one of the 3 aims, you really haven't published much related to that aim because your research direction's fundamentally changed. Though the flip side of that is if you have an aim that you haven't made much progress on, it would be dangerous to just kind of repropose that same aim in the next cycle just because it hasn't been done yet. There's some reviewers may catch on to that based on your previous summary statement or even your progress report, which you include as part of your research strategy. And so next slide. Okay, so this is a bit of a summary, but how do you know whether to renew an R01 versus submitting a new R01? You want to renew an R01 if you think you've been quite productive. So you want to leverage strong publications in the previous period. So that would be a strong case for renewing, and that you think you have exciting new findings that are not incremental, but really will take this research project or proposal in fundamental new direction. And then the last thing is there can be what I think of as sympathy scoring for legacy grants. So I've seen, occasionally this comes up where, someone's renewing a grant for their 45th year of their R01. And it's hard not to, have a kind of a personal, emotional attachment to someone who's had the same grant going for 45 years and not wanting to score it too harshly so that you're the person who kind of prevented like the world record R01 from continuing into its 50th year, for example. But I think even, grants around for maybe 15 years or 20 years get some sort of psychological help just because they are a legacy grant. And so there's probably not a whole lot of people in this audience who've had the same R01 for 20, 25 or more years, but that maybe is something to think about as well. So that's all I have to say.
Great. Thank you so much, Gage, for that. I think we will now, after your talk, I'll starting our legacy grant. But that was super helpful and definitely also, I think, made the audience and the rest of us think about our productivity during the existing research grant and how that's really important when we're thinking about the renewal. So that's very helpful. Great. All right. And I see a lot of engagement in the chat function, and you have really the opportunity of getting them responded to by our wonderful panelists here. Now we are going to spend the remaining 25 minutes on talking about mistakes. And this is a panel discussion kind of style and format. And what I will do is we're going to go over some of the sections that are typically we focus on with regards to how we sort of construct a research grant. Next slide, please. And so first we're going to talk about specific aims. What are some of the mistakes that you see on specific aims? And I'll probably have either Sarah or Tom start us off with this one. And just a reminder for the panelists to raise your hand so I can call on you in the order of that. So either Tom, maybe Sarah. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
I'll go ahead and tackle that. So one of the standard mistakes that can be perceived by the reviewers is interdependent specific aims. So if you propose aims, say you have 3 aims and aims 2 and 3 can only be completed if aim 1 is successful. Sometimes this will be viewed as a critical flaw by the reviewer. So ideally, you should have convergent aims that contribute to testing your hypothesis, but approach the experiments or other studies using complementary approaches and maybe not being tied to the success of one single type of experiment that you're proposing early, especially if there's some risk associated with that.
Great, thank you. Tom?
Yeah, I think this is a little more subtle than what Sarah said, which is very clear. But I think a set of specific aims that don't flow logically from here's where the field is, or here's where we are in this particular set of studies. Here's what the gaps are. Here's what we need to know next. And here's what we hypothesize based on what we've observed before. And then the logic, then the aims, as Sarah said, which are better convergent than interdependent. And then summarizing by saying, here's what this will tell us. And what people often, what I've seen is listing the background and then saying, here are the specific aims without linking them together. So I think you want to make sure it tells a story from here's where we are, what we know, here's what's missing, here's what we hypothesize with some evidence behind it, and then what we're going to do and why it matters. So it's really sort of a synopsis, as you might expect. It's a specific aims page, but make it a synopsis of your whole project, because there are going to be people voting on it, who will read only that. You know, your assigned reviewers will read other things, but many people sitting around the table will be looking at those specific aims while the conversation is going on. Tell a good story with those and make sure it flows logically.
Great, wonderful. All right. And we'll go to the next question. I'll encourage our panelists to raise their hand when they have something to contribute to that topic. So now moving from specific aims and to research strategy. So typically people are asked with regards to how to construct the significance section of that. So what are some of the mistakes that you might have seen in terms of reviewing the grants? So go ahead, Shanita.
Thank you. I think one of the biggest mistakes is not describing, the significance of the proposed work within the context of previous studies. And just a concrete example, I've reviewed applications where the focus was on, a health issue among African Americans, and the reviewers really based their whole question and their significance, without really talking about how their proposed work addressed and will move the field forwards. And they didn't talk about the other previous extensive work that had been done in this particular area. And so they really didn't make a strong case for what was significant about their research within the context of the field. And I think that's a really big, and I saw that mistake quite often. The other related mistake that I have seen is where it is, a particular issue is very, what's the word? It's a subtle change. So not really thinking about the broader context of the field. And I think that's, I'm trying to give an example without talking about specific applications, but it's not violate confidentiality, but those were, it was striking to me what in these more recent examples where it was some were sort of addressing issues that were no longer relevant, and then others were not addressing an issue that continues to be relevant, but not from the perspective of how it sort of advances and will address this particular issue in an important and novel way.
Great, thank you for that. And Gage?
Oh yeah, I just add on to that I've been on a number of reviews where the proposal, there's been similar or even conflicting papers on the same topic that have been published that have not been cited. And there's always a question of, are they purposely not citing them because it decreases the novelty of their proposal or goes against their views? And I think that's always a mistake, because once you have one of the reviewers pick up on that or know about those papers, it can really damage a review. So if you know of similar or even conflicting studies, it's always best to bring those up and then kind of clearly state, how your proposal is different or why you think that, your proposal may come to a different conclusion. If you try to kind of ignore or purposely exclude papers, is going to come back to bite you in a lot of cases.
Great. Thank you for that as well. Very good points taken about providing important context and also acknowledge all the important work, even if it's contradictory or potentially have significant overlap with your work. Great. Next slide, please. So let's talk about innovation. I know that's something that I struggle a lot in terms of how to articulate the innovation in the work. So Sarah, do you want to start us off here?
Sure. Thanks, April. So this is something that I've thought about over many reviews, and this is something that I think is sometimes misinterpreted by reviewers. So in my view, innovation can occur at multiple levels, and I would encourage you to think about what kinds of innovations you have. Sometimes it's viewed that if you're using existing techniques, that proposals are not innovative. And in fact, they can be very innovative if you're applying existing techniques conceptually in different ways. Another thing that I think can be emphasized as an innovation is the development of a multidisciplinary or a transdisciplinary study team that brings unique skills to the table that are typically not applied to that kind of a project. So I think that really thinking about, not just the content of your proposal and whether you're using the latest in technology, but really thinking about conceptual innovation as well as your investigative team can be very helpful.
Great, thank you for that, Sarah. And let's see here. We have also two kind of questions that came in during the meantime. How is innovation viewed for observation or epi studies? Any comments on that? What is important for those aspects?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yes. So the question that's typed is, what is really meant by innovation, but specifically, how is it viewed for, or how is it interpreted for observational or epidemiologic studies? And then Tom, go ahead. You want to start with that? I see your hand up.
I'll make a comment. I don't know if this is about mistakes necessarily, but so I do more human mechanistic research where our proposals are generally asking what we characterize as being really important questions, but the methodologies are not usually particularly novel. Sometimes they can be novel with imaging, but I think for grants like that, there may be a balance between significance and innovation, and emphasizing how critically important the significance is, and particularly making it more concrete than this will be new knowledge, but adding on, I think one of the things that makes, I'm backing up on here, significance important is if it ends with significance with actionable next steps, rather than everybody's going to know more and then something good might happen. So I think, because I've always struggled with demonstrating innovation, because the questions are sort of known, but we apply methodologies. As Sarah said, it might be a team with unique components. But I think one of the strategies for the overall grant is to make sure the significance is really strong, and that the innovation is applying the methodologies to this question to actually get the final answer. And that's not, it doesn't necessarily give you a killer score in innovation, but overall the grant may do well, even if the innovation doesn't score as well. So that's been my experience. Great, thanks, Tom. And then Art?
Yeah, I have a slightly different point of view. I mean, only because review panels feel, I mean, they have to put a score down for innovation. So you don't want to give them an opportunity to not give a 1 or a 2. If there's not enough there, you get a 3. And, some people, even though they're not supposed to, just do averaging. And I don't like to give that opportunity, honestly. So I will always struggle to give them something that they can claim as innovative. And as I said before, providing some kind of a enumeration of what those things are, I think is very helpful, whether it's the unique application of existing methodology to slightly new questions, slightly different populations that are being studied, or new methodology. Any of those things can be put in there. I just don't want to ever leave opportunity for somebody to say, well, I don't really see anything there, I'm going to give them a 3. I just think that can come back and hurt you just by a numbers game.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. All right, we'll go to the next section, which is approach. And under approach preliminary studies, I saw a question earlier on with regards to how much preliminary studies are necessary, or data are necessary. And so I just want our panelists think about that, for example, for an R01 grant. Shanita?
I think it depends on the type of study that you're proposing to do. And so I do translational behavioral science research where a key focus and emphasis is on doing randomized trials to compare different intervention strategies. To not have preliminary data showing some benefit of the interventions is like a death knell to that type of study. I think that you have to have some evidence to say that the intervention works, and so that's essential in a preliminary study section. Relatedly, I think if you you might not be proposing an intervention study, but you might be working in a difficult to reach population or a group that is hard to enroll. And so I think demonstrating in a preliminary study section that it's feasible to recruit this population, that you have access to the intended samples is really critical. So it's hard for me to imagine, and even in an R21, which is an exploratory study where, there's a statement that, preliminary studies not required. I think it's some type of preliminary study is still expected. And, I know as in my own mind, I think for people who are even proposing like an exploratory study, there needs to be something that shows that this is an important area, that you need to do the work and that it's important and that it will have some benefit in the intended direction.
Great, thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, so just speaking a little more from the basic science perspective, I almost have a formula that I use on R01 grants. And, I was listening to Gage talk about grant continuations or grant renewals. And for my, I guess now I know I have to call it a legacy grant. I have a formula for that where I go in very heavy in a section called progress report and preliminary data. I make sure that I cite some preliminary data for each aim strategically, and then I try to sprinkle or spread preliminary data in addition into the experimental plan, just so that the reviewer can see it at the same time as they're reading about a new type of assay that I'm proposing. So I really like to have it not just concentrated on those couple of pages, but interwoven throughout the approach narrative. I think I don't spend a lot of time on preliminary studies that are largely methodological, that are just based on, everyone in the world can do this technique, and do I really need to demonstrate that my lab can do it too if we haven't? But I tend to try to acquire preliminary data for more specialized procedures or to support some of the hypotheses that are being proposed.
Thank you, Sarah. Engage?
Yeah, I just say that, point out there can also be a flip side. So I've seen a few grants where there's so much preliminary data that the reviewers have said, well, really, what are they proposing to do? They've essentially done this whole aim already. And so I think, sometimes I actually hold back some preliminary data just so I can propose it because it's a good experiment. And so I think there's this right balance of proposing enough preliminary data, but not making it seem like you've already done everything, so why fund you for another 5 years?
You are absolutely right.
Great tips from everyone here. Okay, so let's go to the overall strategy and specifically the kind of the methodology and the analysis. What are some of the mistakes that when you were reviewing the grants that you saw people doing in terms of the methodology that they propose? What sort of kind of have led you to potentially give a bad score? All right, Sarah?
Yeah, I just talked, so I'll be brief, but I'd like to echo something that Art said earlier. This is less related to methodology and more related to overall strategy. I think it is the kiss of death if you don't include a beautiful artistic diagram that shows the flow of the experiments, their relationship to your hypotheses and specific aims. And so I look for that first in any grant I review. And I think it's a missed opportunity if you don't include that.
Great. So the graphs, very, very important for that. Shanita?
I think one of the big weaknesses I've seen is when the methods don't align with the specific aims or hypotheses. They don't make sense within that context. And so, and it sort of go, you know, if I've read the method section and I'm like, well, why would they do this if their specific aim is that and their hypothesis is this? How is this method going to allow them to test that hypothesis? Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So making sure critically important alignment of methods with the aims. And Art?
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to say is I've seen a number of proposals where the methods are treated a bit like a black box. Not, you know, I do imaging things, and there's lots of software that does analytic procedures, and a lot of people don't actually understand how they work. And so in their methods section, they're a little bit too brief in terms of understanding the assumptions or limits of a particular strategy, a method that's being applied. And I ding them on that because, you know, there's always nuances in any method. And I think even if you're using something that's relatively tried and true, it's important to demonstrate to the reviewer that you know how to do that, and you know what you can count on and what you can be wary of using a particular method, because otherwise I don't think you're being a good scientist. You know, you always need to understand precisely what you're doing and what it can tell you. So you need to demonstrate that.
Okay, great, thank you. Tom?
I think one way to help avoid what Shanita brought up, and that is to have the methods not really linked to the specific aims, is first of all, obviously present them by the aims, but present at the beginning of each specific aim very briefly. What's the hypothesis? What are the interventions, or, you know, what's the approach? What's the analysis? And what are the anticipated results? And if you do that at the beginning of each aim, it's some discipline to help you write the right stuff, because you can look back and see what you're talking about. But it also helps keep the reviewers oriented to what you're doing, and that helps to avoid sort of a general, you know, drift and not paying attention, not keeping people on track, even including yourself, to what you want to accomplish.
Great. So some tips on how to organize it structurally. Gage?
Yeah, just I had a couple. I mean, Sarah had a great point. I actually tend to use a graphical abstract, sometimes even in the specific aims page, if I have space there. Very similar to what you'd see in like Cell Press or these other journals where you have just a graphical abstract of what the whole paper is about. This is a graphical abstract of what, you know, how the aims of your grant tie together. And that really helps the other reviewers who are not the three reviewers of your grant to really quickly scan your grant and kind of know what your grant is about. The other thing is I've seen some grants where the alternative problems of analysis, they just say, well, you know, I have expertise in all this, so it's all going to work, and I don't envision any problems doing these experiments. For me, that's a kiss of death. Any experiment has faults or reasons, and so that shows a naivete if you just simply say, well, we have expertise in everything and we're confident it will all work. So I think Art touched on that, to have really thoughtful alternative approaches and kind of heading off potential problems that the reviewers may find. And then in terms of the methodology, I often see laundry lists kind of listing every possible experiment you can do for each aim, with very little description of why each of those experiments is important and so I would do more with less. So kind of, there's always many things you can do, but pick what are the most important experiments and kind of go through those in more detail, rather than just simply list a whole bunch of experiments without really providing a rationale or describing how those experiments will get you closer to validating your hypothesis.
Great, thank you, Gage. And I think that also answered partially some of the questions that's in the chat regarding the level of detail that may be needed with regards to the method section. And then feel free to add to that, any of the panelists. All right, I'm going to have Nikki go ahead, advance to the summary statement. So getting the summary statement, and then we are, in the interest of time, go ahead, advance again, and then advanced again. Okay, so I wanted to really focus in our remaining 3 minutes on responding to summary statements and what should you do about inaccuracies? What if you're reading the summary statement, you feel like, gosh, the reviewer they don't get me at all, or if they are stating something that's just you felt was inaccurate, a reflection of what happened, what went on in your grant. So Sarah?
Yeah, and I think Art alluded to this a little bit earlier, but I think that whatever you do, and we all do have to rebut inaccuracies, which are either due to a lack of understanding or sometimes that we've buried the information too deeply in our grant for the reviewer to find it. I'm always very polite and respectful, and I use language like perhaps we didn't make it clear enough in this description. We have enhanced our description, or you know, so that you take you know, the responsibility for, you know, again, re-verifying. And then if it's a factual you know, the reviewer citing one paper in the literature that perhaps you didn't cite, but you've cited other papers in the literature, or something just came out, I think that you can say that the reviewer is correct, that some disagreement exists in the literature, and we have focused our hypothesis based on the data of X, Y, and Z because of this. You know, thus we think this study is less important, but I think just trying to take a respectful and you know, friendly tone and really not taking it personally.
Great advice. Tom?
I think there's a couple of contexts here. If you get your summary statement and you find inaccuracies, my understanding, and we've dealt with this with a large program grant recently, is that if you want to formally contest the accuracy, it'll basically pulls it out of line, and you'll go through a process where it has to be reviewed for, you can contest it and a decision can be made, but you may lose, and we were told we would lose in this particular situation, the opportunity to get our revision in by the next cycle, because you can't revise while that process is going on. So I think rebutting a summary statement for that grant is hard to do. The only time I've done that is when the grant was going to get scored, but there was a proposal to remove a budget for a section, and I rebutted that component and got it put back in. But at least, but I think unless other people have had different experience, we were told fairly clearly, if you want to rebut this for this particular cycle, it's going to be pulled out of line, and that rebuttal will be considered, and you can't revise during that time. I think what Sarah may have been talking about is when you go back in for a revision, then I think exactly what you said is true. We say, if I did it, I'm sorry, and here's how we're going to fix it. And don't ever try to say you got it wrong, because they hold all the cards.
Tips. Great. Nikki, we can advance to the next slide. We are unfortunately at the end of our time, and your feedback matters. So please complete the post-meeting survey. I believe when the link closes, they'll get that as I was told. And we can stop sharing the screen. And I just wanted to, first of all, I thank really our panelists, Shanita, Gage, Art, Sarah, and Tom for really excellent presentations and really timely and important advice. I want to thank Nikki and Christina for their organization for this. And very importantly, I want to thank our audience for really your engagement, your excellent questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them due to the limited time that we have. Believe it or not, we did spend an hour and a half together. And but if you ever miss us, this will be recorded and you can go back and watch this again. And please feel free to share the link with your friends as well. With that, thank you very much and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, April.
Thank you.
Thanks, April.